During the late 1960s and early 1970s, Boston was erupting in racial violence, but the cause of the tension was more complex than skin color. Boston was geographically segregated, people lived in divided sections according to their ethnicity and especially class. Although they were separated, one thing remained constant for most people living in South Boston: how poor people were. In South Boston, there was a gradient of poverty. Those living near Old Colony were the poorest, and as they got closer to the ocean, people became more economically stable. White people as well as black people lived in awful conditions and often in unsafe neighborhoods. Houses filled with cockroaches and streets filled with gangs and fighting. If you came to live in the neighborhood, you were considered an outsider and would have your window smashed in. Newcomers were only taken in when they had their first fight, win or lose, boy or girl. Stealing and reselling goods was considered a respectful job, for it showed both a strong work ethic and provided cheap designer clothing to the poor residents of projects. Despite the fights and amongst the South Boston inhabitants, there were integrity rules prohibiting activities such as stealing from other South Boston residents, and newcomers often had to learn the rules quickly to avoid becoming a victim of violence or crime in their neighborhoods. Despite the horrible conditions, residents held fierce loyalty for their communities and their neighborhoods. This very sense of loyalty is what made it hard for newcomers to be welcomed. The neighborhoods in South Boston were often segregated based on ethnicity, as well as various levels of economic stability. This physical separation created a mental separation as well, which caused tension between communities, and even crossing neighborhood lines could cause fights to break out. This barrier between different communities created a new dynamic between white people. Due to the poverty in South Boston, people were very insecure about their economic stability. Only thing keeping them feeling powerful was their superiority over black people. It was this fragile superiority about their economic status that came out as racism in South Boston. This strange dynamic created a lot of tension and anger. Those of a lower place disliked those above them because they were jealous and wanted what others had. Those of a higher standing hated those below them because they seemed undignified, dirty, and undeserving. However, due to the systems such as busing, they were kept separate and could exist in their respective areas. It was only when the social caste system and hierarchy was threatened by a wealthy suburban judge that it all began to collapse. The Judge W. Arthur Garrity made the decision to shift the school busing routes in a way that made sense based on proximity to the schools and not the social caste. Initially, people simply boycotted schools and took to the streets in protest with signs pointed more towards Irish pride or anti-communism. Unfortunately, protesters growing frustrated with the lack of change escalated to a harsher form of protest. Irish Catholics, a group previously attacked by the Ku Klux Klan white supremacists, began making signs with KKK written on them. Protesters taunted police and threw rocks at the buses. With the protesters turning on and attacking the police grew frustrated and began retaliating. A state of constant escalation and retaliation began, where both police and rioters believed the other as the enemy. Rioters attacked police and their vehicles, while police began to beat on women and children. Not even gunshots could scare people away from the beating on innocent black people who wound up in the wrong place. Incidents like these brought the black communities to grow violent in response. These riots eventually died down as the police presence became too large, but protests still took place. Juniors and seniors began dropping out of school rather than go with those black students, and the number of graduates dropped dramatically. Crime and teen pregnancy rates grew. The new bus routes took their toll on South Boston.